Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session, which is all about navigating through the many challenges of strong customer authentication. As you know, or may not, strong customer authentication goes hand in hand with open banking. Security is paramount, as you need to secure data access and transactions and create trust with end users. SCA is wider than open banking. It covers internet banking and all sorts of online payments. Our goal with this session is to help stakeholders of the payment service providers, naming them issuing banks, understand the many challenges that they are facing when they engage into an SCA project, so that they can actually make the right decisions and plan ahead. The many challenges that we will discuss today come from a European perspective, but this should nonetheless be interesting to other organizations outside Europe. We are at OK, a Norwegian-based company, and we operate mainly in Europe indeed. OK is a compliant strong customer authentication platform provider, and we help issuers in Europe mainly, as I was saying, enable future-proof security around transactions and authentication processes via the banking and the financial apps. The insights that we will be discussing today come from the many discussions we have with all industry players, namely, I was saying issuers, all kinds of issuers, processors, e-wallet providers, remittance services, bank-as-a-service platforms, any organization that needs to enable open banking APIs, and take care of strong customer authentication. My name is Fabien Ignacolo. I'm the CEO of OK, and we have for this session Erik Vassosen, our CTO, and Erik will help us and help me shed light on the different challenges brought by SCA. Hi, Erik.
Thank you, Fabien. Also, I'm a CTO. The topics we will review today are not technical at all. They're just highlighting some challenges or even pitfalls that we and our customers face when engaging into compliance projects. This type of project can be complicated. They're halfway between technology and compliance, with many topics to take care of. Even as a technology provider and a software vendor, our experience is that it is often the non-technical challenges that are the hardest to solve, as there might be legacy systems, customers without smartphones, complicated integrations with multiple vendors, and everything having to fit sometimes complicated compliance requirements.
Thank you, Erik. Let's start with the first challenge is, of course, reaching strong customer authentication compliance. The main issue here is to really understand the regulatory framework in your region. This is very much a view from Europe, and that can be shared, of course, I'm not sure as a best practice, but at least this is the state of the art when it comes to regulation. So SCA is a complex topic. It was first brought by PSD2, the Payment Services Directive 2, and SCA was actually defined later by the Regulatory Technical Standards, the RTS. It was amended and clarified through different opinions from the European Banking Authority over the last 3 years. So basically, we ended up with a framework that is rather complicated or complex with different layers, and it is quite difficult to navigate through this. So you might have, as an organization, internal resources and expertise to drive through this knowledge and this type of projects. But what we recommend is that you should resort to independent consultants and external help. These people have driven these projects before, and they are fully aware of all the regulatory, security, and technical aspects. And I'm certainly forgetting the end user experience aspects as well. When it comes to SCA itself, SCA is just a subset of the RTS. The RTS is presenting a lot of different topics around SCA. And the first important one is the liability. Issuers or issuing banks are nearly becoming responsible for everything. So there's a real liability shift, and you need to understand this and organize accordingly. There are, in the RTS, there are many exemptions to SCA, exemptions that are mainly around online, or if not all, online payments. So you need to understand the exemptions and how they apply and how you prepare for that. The most complex one, maybe in those exemptions, is the transaction risk analysis. Given the amount of the transaction and the level of fraud of the e-merchant and its acquirer, you might bypass SCA or not. So you could directly go to the transaction. But if there's fraud around it, then you might have still to apply SCA, even though you have the right level of amount and fraud. So you have to do fraud monitoring, you have to do transaction monitoring. So this makes the whole setup far more complex than just SCA. You have, as an issuer, you have to do audits, evaluations by third parties. You have to ensure traceability of everything that the end user is doing when authenticating, and ensure vendor compliance, and let alone, of course, the choice of multi-factors or second factor as part of the RTS. So that's the first challenge. Well, usually you should get help. I was talking about the two factors. I think this is a very specific challenge that you are facing, is what couple of two factors should you implement as part of your authentication strategy. Now you have to choose two factors between three options. First is the knowledge factor, something I know. It can be a secret PIN, it can be a one-time password, it can be a secret question, etc. The second option is something I own. It's the possession factor. That would be a smartphone, a token, a dongle, whatnot. And the third option would be the inherence, something I am. And this is the realm of biometrics. So that would be face recognition, fingerprint recognition, iris, etc. So you will have to choose two factors among those possibilities, and of course implement the security mechanisms in the background so that you actually protect those factors, that you ensure that if one factor is broken, the other one is still safe. And Erik will cover, of course, more of the security challenges in a few minutes. That's okay. Well, we've thought about this couple and these two factors a lot, obviously, and we came up with a solution which we think is as frictionless as can be. So the first factor that we chose is the smartphone. So we use the smartphone that is very widely used and brought everywhere by users as a first factor, the possession factor, and we integrate our security services to banking apps. So in case of out-of-band or decoupled authentication, then we would check the smartphone, the possession factor, and then the stepped authentication would be done through the banking app with a variety of factors. Now, as you can see on the right-hand side, the pyramid here shows a growing friction when you're using factors. The most frictionless is resorting to biometrics. So that's the most frictionless. Then you would use maybe as a fallback or as a second option, a secret PIN. So this is a secret code that doesn't change, that we would enter into the banking app. Third one is OTP, one-time password by app, not by SMS. So you would see, you would be presented with an OTP and you would enter it into your banking app. So that's a bit more friction, of course, because you have to see an OTP and recopy it. And that's the same for SMS. But Erik will talk about SMS in a second. OTP by SMS presents quite a lot of challenge. And in this case, it cannot be used alone. So you would have to associate it with something else, a password, or, well, hence the question mark. So a bit more friction. Then you have remote dial. That's for non-smartphone users. If you don't have a smartphone, then you receive an automated call that presents you with the transaction details. That's and an OTP by automated voice call. This is a bit more friction still, obviously. And at the bottom, we think the most friction will come from the use of credentials. We have many accounts, many passwords. We usually don't remember them or don't keep track of them. So that can be, of course, a big friction. Now, having said that, let me show you what a user journey would look like from an open banking perspective in the case of a payment initiation. So we have My Pretty Things here. My Pretty Things is an e-merchant, but they they can initiate payment as defined in open banking. So I'm selecting something that I want to buy here. I go to the checkout and I'm presented with different payment options. Now, the one that is interesting us is the pay by bank account, so the account-to-account payment. And I'm selecting, as you can see, select your account. I'm selecting my cash, which is actually my bank. So I want to pay from this account. So I confirm. Upon confirmation, that's how we implemented it, but we trigger a push notification, and we think users are quite used to this kind of mechanisms. So there are, of course, a variety of way of notifying the user, but here we do a push notification. I click on the push notification for my bank, so I trust it, and I'm prompted directly to this interface where I'm presented with the transaction details. In PSD2, this is the dynamic linking in action. So I'm presenting the specific information from the transaction to the user, amount, the name of the merchant, or the account number where I will make the payment. And the color has changed because the SCA in the background has taken over as part of the the OK services have taken over as part of the banking app. That's why we put it in blue. So there's security behind, and security that is actually making sure that what you see here is actually the genuine transaction. There's no overlay type of attack or screen coming over at the exact moment where I do the authentication. The system recognized that I was using Touch ID. I do the authentication. This is happening. It's successful, and I'm prompted back to the merchant site where the purchase is successful and completed. Now, if you look at the association of a smartphone possession factor and here fingerprint recognition and biometrics, this is as frictionless as can be. The next topic, I mentioned this in my presentation, but Erik will drill down into the many challenges presented by OTP, the famous OTP by SMS.
We should focus a bit on one-time PIN by SMS. OTP by SMS won't disappear overnight, but we believe that app-based authentication will take over. The OTP by SMS is not secured. The text is not encrypted locally on the device, and it can often be transferred over the wireless network in a not very secure manner. And it can be intercepted or stolen by malware, certainly on the local device. There are limitations when using OTP by SMS in a PSD2 way. In fact, combining OTP by SMS with app-based authentication might create confusion. Last but not least, OTP by SMS is a variable cost compared with user-based pricing that we can offer with app-based authentication. One of the big challenges facing many incumbent banks and issuers today is that they rely on OTP by SMS for authentication. As Fabien mentioned earlier, you're required to have 2 of those 3 factors for SA. That means that an SMS can be used to verify the possession of the device, as a phone number is linked to the SIM card owned by the user. In addition to the possession factor, the user then has to remember a password or at least a secret code, which can be the second knowledge element. The problem here is that SMS messages are an easy target for malware, which only leaves a password to protect the security of an account. As an example here, any kind of malware you look at today, they first steal the text messages, and then they present a user interface to the end user, which looks a lot like your standard banking login screen. So a lot of users are tricked into entering their passwords or secret PIN codes. That means that the malware can reproduce the user or run the software in an emulated environment, often starting transaction without the user being aware. This is a particularly big problem with banking apps, as the attacker then only has to attack a single device. Text messages are easy to steal, and then you only have to trick the user into entering the password to get access to their account. For a truly strong customer authentication, we need to do better than this. A second issue is down to the cost. The cost of OTP by SMS varies with usage, which can be quite costly in some markets. With app-based solutions, the authentication can take place out of band from the banking app in a secure environment, and the cost can be dramatically lower as well.
Thank you, Erik. The next challenge is that when you are engaging into an SCA project, you will be facing specific SCA cases. The first one is that corporate payments. Corporate payments are an exemption of the RTS. or PSD2 when it comes to SCA, but they have still to be protected. And when it comes to corporate payments, users would be more on a PC than using smartphones, for instance. So you need to think of ways of covering this use case. The most, I think, important one is almost as important as corporate payments is non-smartphone users. This can be for large incumbent banks as high as 20 to 30% of the user base not having a smartphone or not using a banking app. And there's also an extreme case where you do use a smartphone and a banking app, but you don't have any data coverage when you do the authentication. So for that, you need to think of fallbacks. We talked about the remote dial, which introduced an automated call. This is, of course, friction as opposed to app-based authentication, but it's still compliant, and you still have a fallback for this particular case. And think also about accessibility, and that's also something that could be covered by a remote dial. We need to think of these cases. The last one is not really an SCA case, but it's really making sure that you trust the relationship between the user and their devices. And that's an important thing, because when you enroll a new user, you want to make sure you enroll the right device. And it's even more important when you do re-enrollment. And re-enrollment is a very critical security phase for issuers, because you have lost your phone, it's been stolen, you have reset it or whatnot. So you have to go through this, and you need to make sure as an issuer that there has not been any SIM swap attack or redirection on this particular phone. So this is something that is not exactly SCA related, but that's very much linked, and especially in terms of security. So these are some of the use cases that you will be facing when engaging into a project. The next one, and we've mentioned this several times now, is how to implement strong security and what choices will you face.
So what does it take to have truly strong security in an app? Today, more and more payments are done on a single device. The smartphone is a single device where everything takes place, where the payment is initiated and where the customer is authenticated and the transaction is verified. This makes it very important to protect the authentication factors. One aspect that is important to remember is that it's not enough to verify just the possession of the device and the biometric of the customer. You also have to make sure that what the user is seeing is what the user is supposed to see. If the user is tricked into verifying a fraudulent transaction by malware modifying what the user is seeing, you're still liable, even if the customer authentication was otherwise done properly. Another thing to keep in mind is that security has to be forward-looking. It can be a matter of hours or days between a security vulnerability becoming public and the vulnerability being used on tens of thousands of devices. This can be a big worry if you're liable for fraud. In practice, this means that the security has to be a key feature of the banking app, that you have to be ready to face the next unknown attack. As a security software vendor, the next topic is central to our business, the innovative threats that we're seeing from malware. Malware is currently the most innovative forms of attack that we are seeing today. However, you cannot deal with malware the same way you do on PCs. You cannot track virus signatures, as you as a PSP simply haven't got access to the files in the same way that you got on a PC. Protecting your entire application is one option, but there is often a balancing act between fast implementation of new securities with high security. One way of solving the security requirement is to focus only on the authentication process and detect any attempt at tampering with the transaction or authentication. And if something is found, raise alarm. Another challenge is mass attacks, where thousands of customers are targeted. In an example from last December, 16,000 customer phones were infected with malware, probably from a targeted phishing attack. The malware stole the user's credentials, then text messages sent with OTP codes. This allowed the attacker to automate running the banking app in an emulator, where they could impersonate the user, initiate transactions, and so on. What if it is thousands of customers transferring money to each other before they end up in a small bank abroad through SEPA instant payments? That can be a real headache for any kind of bank or issuer. Besides strong device checks and avoiding text messages, one way of avoiding this type of attack is to make the secure execution environment unique, so that it is harder to target thousands of devices. Besides the threat of malware, another challenge is that PSPs and issuers have to deal with is to what to do with devices running older versions of operating systems. About half to 2/3 of Android devices in use won't get updates from the manufacturer. Companies like Google and Samsung are pretty good, with around 3 years of support. But the phones you can buy for $30 from AliExpress or from a kiosk abroad simply won't get that kind of support. There are critical issues such as remote exploitable security vulnerabilities released every couple of weeks, and local privilege escalations that can give an attacker a root access. So using a device that doesn't get security updates can be a real problem, both for the end user and for the PSP. As a result, we are already seeing that some banks are denying transactions from older devices. The situation is a little bit better on iOS, where devices as old as a 5S can get critical updates from Apple. But the reality is that in many markets, a large percentage of users have old and often cheap devices. And they often even don't have a fingerprint reader. This makes the security of the SCA process even more important, as the reality is that many customers are using smartphones with the security level of a computer running Windows XP.
Thank you, Erik. Last but not least comes the integration question, which is a really important part. SCA is a pinpoint solution, but it has a lot of implication and ramifications. So whenever we or you are approaching a project, you might want to have SCA as part of a value chain or a pre-integrated ecosystem, if you will, to mitigate the risks, ensure of course, the success of the project, mitigate the risks, and speed time to market. And this is very much how we are approaching any single SCA project, is that we want to make sure that we are part of a larger ecosystem and that we are pre-integrated so that we make life easier for the PSPs, the issuing banks. Two aspects to look at. It's the backend integration and the front-end integration. Regarding backend integration, if you're talking about open banking and internet banking SCA, you need to integrate the SCA solution to an identity and access management tool. This is where you will define when you do the SCA and how you're going to do it, through a device and what method, etc. When it comes to e-commerce SCA or online payments or card not present payments, you also have to do another backend integration with access control servers driven by the 3DS protocol. And for both cases at OK, we make sure that we do integrations in the background so that you just need to set parameters as opposed to developing integration. So that's being part of an ecosystem, if you will. The second aspect is front-end integration. I was talking about enrollment and re-enrollment of users. So we have a link with the KYC, the Know Your Customer process, and we would actually link the device. We would create the possession factor and link possession factor to the security services, our security services at this stage. So we need to think of this integration. When a user uses his or her mobile to do a selfie as part of this process, we take this opportunity to register the device. The bigger challenge in integration is to make sure that we are, as an SCA solution, we have 100% match to the UI and to the UX that you've invested in at the moment of SCA. So it's really a matter of blending the interface with the security mechanisms so that we can still ensure that we maximize the user experience and we make the transaction compliant. So there are ways of doing this. This can be a bit of a conundrum. It can be solved well with solutions like OK, but I don't want to get too much into the details here, but this was to give you an idea of the different interactions in this ecosystem whenever you're doing an SCA. And we mentioned fraud monitoring. There are other topics. This was really to try to do a summary. There are other topics that we would be linked to as well. Now we've come to the end of this presentation. Hopefully you got some interesting insights and which will help you make the right decisions and understand the main implications of such projects. Just one last word, we are looking for strategic partnerships. As we were saying, we want to be part of a larger pre-integrated ecosystem. So if you recognize yourselves in the different areas that we touched upon, make sure you reach out to us. You have our email addresses. So if you have also any question, please do not hesitate. And thank you.